الحمد لله وكفى والسلام على عباده الذين اصطفى أما بعد. Respected listeners, Alhamdulillah, today we completed the first Sunnah Tarawih. As I mentioned in the very beginning, we will be reciting 1 1/4 parts each day till we complete 20 out of 30 parts, and then we will be reciting 1 part each day. And in this way, from the very beginning of the Qur'an, inshallah, we will complete the whole of the Qur'an by the end of the month. Today we recited Surah Al-Fatiha, and then the first surah after Surah Al-Fatiha, Surah Al-Baqarah, which is the longest surah in the Qur'an, and because of its length we only completed half of it today. The remaining parts we shall complete tomorrow, inshallah. Surah Al-Fatiha is a Makki surah, a surah of the Meccan period, and it is a very small surah. Many ulama say that this is the first complete surah to have been revealed of the Qur'an. It's not the first, these aren't the first verses. The first verses are from Surah Iqra' bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq, i.e. Surah Al-Alaq, also Surah Al-Muzammil and Surah Al-Muddathir. These surahs were revealed first, but not the complete surahs, only some of the verses. But the first complete surah to be revealed in its entirety was Surah Al-Fatiha, according to many scholars. Surah Al-Fatiha has been named by the Prophet ﷺ himself as the greatest surah in the entire Qur'an. And one of the reasons is that if we ponder over the meaning of these few verses, we will realize that more or less a summary of the Qur'an is contained therein. And Allah Azza wa Jalla speaks about His power, His greatness, His glory, that all praise belongs to Him, His compassion, His mercy, His majesty, His kingdom, that He is the one and only on the Day of Judgment also. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about the state of the true believers, that they turn to Allah in worship and only to Him in seeking assistance, and that we turn to Him in seeking guidance. And Allah Azza wa Jalla speaks about Tawheed, the concept of Risala, those who follow the Prophet ﷺ and those who didn't. Allah also refers to the Jews and the Christians and divides the whole of creation into two: those who followed the path of Allah and those upon whom Allah's anger descended, and those who went astray. In many ways, if we ponder over the verses of Surah Al-Fatiha, we will see that these verses contain the summary of the entire Qur'an. That in itself is another topic. We then started Surah Al-Baqarah. As I said, this is the longest surah in the Qur'an, and it's a surah of the Madani period. Throughout the next 30 days or so, whilst explaining the summary of the portion that has been recited in Taraweeh, I will be mentioning a lot about Madani and Makki surahs. And if I can just explain 1 or 2 principles now, these principles will facilitate the understanding of the entire Qur'an and help us understand many of the topics and references of Makki and Madani surahs. The Prophet ﷺ received the first verses of the Qur'an in Revelation when he was 40 years of age. For the next 13 years, the Prophet ﷺ stayed in Mecca and preached to the people. And then, when he was approximately 53 years of age, Prophet ﷺ did hijrah to Medina and spent the next 10 years there until he left the world. So over a period of 23 years, from the age of 40 till the Prophet ﷺ's 63rd year, the Qur'an was revealed in portions, in pieces. Now, of those 23 years, 13 were spent in Mecca and the remaining 10 in Medina. But life in Medina and life in Mecca was very, very different, even for the Prophet ﷺ and the Muslims. As a result, this was reflected in the kind of verses and the style of the language of these verses of the Qur'an. In Mecca, the Prophet ﷺ and the Muslims resided amongst the mushrikeen, amongst the Quraysh, amongst the Arab pagans. The Muslims weren't organized, they weren't so great in number, they didn't have any strength whatsoever. Many of the Muslims were slaves or freed slaves and foreigners, or those of weak backgrounds. They weren't necessarily the rich and the mighty. And they were scattered. because of the overwhelming force of the pagan Arabs, both in number and in strength, in numbers and in strength, the Muslims were forced to worship Allah secretly, and they could not openly declare their faith, nor could they openly invite others. Furthermore, when a few Muslims did invite others, and the Prophet ﷺ himself did work on others, he had to face the pagan Arabs. Now these mushrikeen, these pagan Arabs, believed in Allah as the creator, as the sustainer of the heavens and the earth. They also believed in him as the supreme God, the supreme deity. But they did not believe that he was alone. They believed in the other gods besides him. Nor did they believe in any concept of life after death. They did not believe in the hereafter. They did not believe in Jannah and in Jahannam. But they did believe in Allah. And they also believed that Allah was the greatest. So these things were not new to them. That's why in many of the Meccan surahs, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has revealed verses that address these topics, i.e. life after death, Jannah, Jahannam, examples and evidences and proofs of life after death. Also verses of Tawheed and comparing Allah to the false idols that they would worship. And Allah speaks about the abomination and the evil of shirk and the purity of Tawheed, etc. Also, because the pagan Arabs were very poetic people, and for them, one of the greatest miracles of humanity, of the humans, was the power of speech. And therefore, they appreciated speech and poetry more than anything else. To them, more than strength and power and wealth was the gift of speech. So, in the Meccan surahs, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has really confounded the pagan Arabs of Mecca and the surrounding region by the language of the Qur'an, which is extremely powerful. And the language of the Meccan surahs is very poetic, very abrupt, very strong, sharp, very brief, very rhyming, and the verses are more poetic, are more in poetry, in poem than in prose. That's another difference. So the Meccan surahs tend to concentrate on these topics of life after death, Jannah, Jahannam, the power of Allah, the oneness of Allah, the evil of shirk, the signs of Allah's oneness and His power in His creation, etc. And also, because in Mecca the Muslims were suffering at the hands of the Quraysh, they were persecuted, many of them were executed, many of them were tortured to death, many of them were tortured but survived, and many Muslims felt helpless. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also revealed many surahs containing accounts of the people of the past, that there were prophets alayhimus salatu wasalam who came in the past and who invited their peoples, but they still didn't believe them, they still didn't follow them, but the prophets were patient, and those few followers that they had were also patient, and then ultimately victory belonged to Allah and His Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam and the messengers, despite their small number, and despite the might and the power of these many different civilizations and many different peoples, they all lost and they were all defeated, and many of them perished without any remaining sign whatsoever. And in this way, Allah Azza wa Jal in the Meccan surah speaks about the former prophets alayhimus salatu wassalam and the peoples that they faced, so that by studying and by reciting these surahs, the Muslims of Mecca could compare themselves to the suffering believers of the past, and they could compare the Prophet ﷺ to the prophets of the past, and they could compare the Quraysh to the tyrannical, oppressive people of the past, and that ultimately it was always the prophets of Allah and their followers who triumphed and who succeeded. So this is another famous topic of the Meccan surahs. Apart from these topics, the language of the Meccan surahs is hard, abrupt, strong, poetic, very majestic, very full of majesty, very majestic, and extremely eloquent. Compared to that, when the Prophet ﷺ travelled to Medina and he did hijrah, now it was a completely different scene and environment and atmosphere altogether. They were no longer oppressed. The Quraysh no longer had a hold over them. The Muslims were free to declare their faith and to worship in numbers. More and more people became Muslim. For the first time, there was a sense of a community, and people were living together. Now laws were needed to regulate the social, private and communal life of the Muslims in Medina. the Muslims gathered and built their masjids, something that could not be done in Mecca. So now the Muslims were free to worship. And they also faced different dangers and different threats. Unlike Mecca, now the enemy was the Jewish presence in Medina, as well as some Christians, but more so the Jewish presence. And unlike Mecca, because in Mecca there was no need for anybody to become a hypocrite. They either embraced Islam and suffered as a result, or they just refused to embrace Islam whatsoever and remained mushrikeen and enemies. But in Medina, because of the large number of Muslims and their power and their growing wealth, people felt that they could no longer oppose them openly, but nor did they want to become Muslim either. So they adopted the third way of embracing Islam ostensibly and falsely, but remaining disbelievers at heart, either for their own selfish interests or mischievously and maliciously to sow the seeds of discord and strife from within the Muslim community and to damage, or so they thought, Islam from within. So after the Hijrah, a new threat arose that was non-existent before: the hypocrites. That's why in the Meccan surahs, very rarely are the Jews and the Christians referred to, and very rarely are the hypocrites referred to. But in the Madani surahs, the mushrikeen aren't referred to that much, but the Jews, the Christians, more so the Jews, sometimes the Christians, and the hypocrites are often referred to. Also, many laws were revealed after the Hijrah: the laws of Salah, the laws of Jihad, the laws of Zakah, of Hajj, the laws of fasting, the laws of halal and haram, what can be eaten, what cannot be consumed, etc. So many of these laws were revealed after the Hijrah, after the Prophet ﷺ arrived in Medina. That's why many of the Madani surahs contain laws upon laws. Furthermore, one difference between the Meccan and the Madani surahs is that of style and language. The Meccan surahs, like I said, for the sake of the mushrikeen, were extremely powerful, hard-hitting, very frightening as well, because of the accounts of Jannat and Jahannam and the day of judgment and life after death. Also, they were very poetic, very abrupt, very brief, both in the length of the surah as well as in the length of the verses. But there's a complete contrast in the Madani surahs. The Madani surahs are very flowing, very long. The verses are long, the surahs are long, full of prose, but they are no less eloquent or powerful. It's just the styles are very different, and each has its unique nature. These are just some of the differences that, if people keep in mind, it would be very easy to understand the nature of these surahs, and it would be very easy to understand the contents of the entire Qur'an. We began Surah Al-Baqarah and we recited only half of it today. As I said, because Surah Al-Baqarah is a Madani surah, I would also like to mention that when I say Meccan surahs and Madani surahs, most Meccan surahs are entirely Meccan, i.e. they were revealed entirely in Mecca. Maybe not in one go, but in portions, but all of the verses are of the Meccan period. But with the Madani surahs, not all the Madani surahs are entirely Madani, i.e. on the most part they will be Madani, but a few verses may be of the Meccan period. This was because the Qur'an is not set in the sequence and the order as we read it today, in the order that it was revealed in. But the Qur'an was revealed to the Prophet ﷺ in a particular order, and then it was reset in a different order for the purpose of recitation. So the Prophet ﷺ would receive different verses at different times, and then he would instruct the Sahaba radiallahu anhum to place this verse in this surah of the Qur'an, and in this way the Qur'an was complete. So the Qur'an's revelation, as well as the sequence and the order of the verses and the surahs, both are divine from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, Surah Al-Baqarah, in the beginning, Allah Azza wa Jal praises the believers and speaks of them, then He speaks about the disbelievers. But both, for the believers He devotes 3 verses, to the disbelievers He devotes 2 verses. And then Allah speaks about the hypocrites. And for them, Allah Azza wa Jal has used 13 complete verses. Now, why 3 verses for the believers, 2 verses for the disbelievers, 13 verses for the hypocrites? Not because they mean more, or that they matter more, but because this is their nature. A believer is honest, both in heart and in speech. He is honest with himself, with the people, and with Allah. He says, I believe. That's what he says, that's what he believes by heart, and that's what he practices with his body and in his life. A disbeliever is also very honest. He's honest with himself, he's honest with the people, and he's honest with Allah. So he tells the people, look, I'm not a believer. He says he disbelieves with his tongue and he disbelieves with his heart. And he lives a life of a disbeliever accordingly. But he doesn't try to deceive anyone, not even the people, let alone Allah. But a hypocrite is the worst. Because a hypocrite, nobody knows the truth about him except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he says one thing with his tongue. He believes another and he does another. And in the process, he thinks he's very intelligent. He thinks he's very noble and wise. And he thinks he's got everybody fooled. He's fooling the people. And he, ma'adallah, because Allah Azza wa Jal says in the very second verse about the hypocrites, يُخَادِعُونَ Allah, they attempt to deceive Allah. So the hypocrite thinks he's also fooling Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's why Allah hates him so much. That at least a disbeliever is honest in his kufr. But a hypocrite, he even tries to deceive Allah Azza wa Jal. And because the nature of a hypocrite is very dubious, it's ambiguous, only Allah knows the truth. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala devotes more verses to the hypocrites, not because they mean more, but because in order to understand them, a greater effort is required. And Allah condemns them. Allah hates the hypocrites more than He hates the disbelievers. And that's why in one verse of the Qur'an, Allah Azza wa Jalla says, إِنَّ الْمُنَافِقِينَ فِي الدَّرْكِ الْأَسْفَلِ مِنَ النَّارِ. Verily, the hypocrites will be in the lowest depths of Jahannam. A hypocrite will suffer more. He will be punished more. And he will be ridiculed and humiliated and disgraced more. And thrown deeper into Jahannam than even the kafir. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ has warned us against hypocrisy in Islam. That because hypocrisy is so detestable, it's so resented in the view of Allah and His Rasul ﷺ. And some of the traits of hypocrisy are dishonesty in speech, dishonesty in trust and dishonesty in speech. And dishonesty in fulfilling promises. These are three signs that the Prophet ﷺ most famously referred to in one hadith. But the first sign of a hypocrite, mentioned in many hadith, is when he speaks, he lies. Lying is a trait of hypocrisy. And if a person does not abstain from lying, a day will come when, Allah forbid, that lying will actually take him to nifaq and hypocrisy. Allah then, after speaking about the believers, the disbelievers and the hypocrites, Allah Azza wa Jal speaks about the power of the Qur'an. Allah speaks about the signs in His creation, mentions the rewards in Jannah for the believers. Then Allah Azza wa Jal speaks about the creation of Sayyidina Adam alayhi salatu wassalam and the angels' surprise at his creation, conversations that took place between Sayyidina Adam alayhi salatu wassalam and the angels, and then Allah's instruction to the angels as well as the rest of creation to do sajda and to prostrate to Sayyidina Adam alayhi salatu wassalam, Shaitan's refusal, Shaitan's promise to deceive and to lead astray Sayyidina Adam alayhi salatu wassalam and the rest of mankind, and then how he succeeded in deceiving Sayyidina Adam and his wife Ummuna Hawa alayhi salatu wassalam. As a result of their mistake, they were both banished from Jannah, even though they were placed therein before. And after being banished from Jannah, Allah Azza wa Jalla instructed them to descend upon the earth. And here they and their children will live only for a short while. This is not our Jannah, but this is our place of test. And this is our abode of trials and tribulations. And in this test, whoever accepts the guidance of Allah, they shall return to their original abode of Jannah. And he who rejects the test of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the guidance of Allah, and fails in this test, for him, neither will he remain on the dunya, nor will he return to his original abode of Jannah, but for him is a third place, the fire of Jahannam for eternity. Allah then speaks about Banu Israel, the Jews. In the Qur'an, the Jews are referred to as the Yahud as well as Banu Israel, the children of Israel. Israel, pronounced Israel in English. Israel is actually the second name, the alias of Sayyidina Yaqub alayhi salatu wassalam. Sayyidina Yaqub alayhi salatu wassalam, the father of Sayyidina Yusuf, and the son of Sayyidina Ishaq, and the grandson of Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salatu wassalam. He had a second name, an alias, called Israel. So famously the Jews refer to their great-grandfather as Yaqub alayhi salatu wasalam as Israel. So the Jews are called the Jews, the Yahud, as well as the children of Israel, the children of Israel. So here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about the children of Israel alayhi salatu wasalam, i.e. the Jews. The reason for, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala discusses the Jews for approximately Subhanallah. For more than 90 verses of Surah Al-Baqarah, just in the beginning. Then he returns to them again later on. He said to them in reply that Allah has instructed me to tell you that if you want to know the identity of the killer, slaughter a cow. They said to Sayyidina Musa alayhi salatu salam, "Attakhiduna huzwa, do you take us as a joke?" They didn't say, "Are you joking with us?" They said, "Attakhiduna huzwa, O Musa, do you take us as a joke?" See, Banu Israel never, how could they respect the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? They never respected their own Prophet, Sayyidina Musa alayhi salatu salam. And all of these stories show. On one occasion I said that they wanted lentil seeds, they wanted dal, they wanted onions, they wanted cucumbers, and they wanted garlic, instead of man and salwa. Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam was so exasperated. He prayed to Allah that this is what they want. Allah said, okay, they'll have to fight for it. Man and salwa, we'll give them for free. But if they want dal, they'll have to fight for it. So Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam was told to take them to a certain land and fight there. And once they had conquered the land, then they could farm there, and as part of their harvest and their crops, they could reap dal and onions. So Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam took them, and then he took a small band of Banu Israel on a reconnaissance mission, so that they could reconnoiter and find out who they were up against. And when they went to that land of Philistine, they saw the Palestinians, the original Palestinians, mighty people, warriors, just like they are today. And they said, no way. See, and there was only a small reconnaissance group of a few leaders. Sayyidina Musa alayhi salatu wassalam knew his people. So he said to them that because most of the people were waiting behind, and this was only a small band of men, he took a promise of every one of them. He took a new oath that you will not go back to the people and tell them how mighty and warrior-like these people are. They all promised that we will not divulge this information, because otherwise the people would refuse to fight. They went, and the first thing they did was squeal. And they told all the people that this is what they like. So ma'adallah, this is what I say about respect. And Allah quotes this in the Qur'an. The whole of Banu Israel turned round to Sayyidina Musa alayhi salatu wasalam and said to him, اذهب أنت وربك فقاتلا إنا هاهنا قاعدون. You go and your Lord go, and you two fight. We are here waiting, seated. So they disrespected him then, and they disrespect him now. I was reading a Jewish magazine, a Jewish newspaper. It's a newspaper published by the Jews. It's a Jewish newspaper in this country. And it was during that time when a lot of these conservatives in opposition, about 7 members of the shadow cabinet, turned out to have experimented with drugs at some time in their life. 7 members of the shadow cabinet were druggies. And during that time, it's about 1.5 years ago, there was a huge uproar about drugs, and there was a lot of discussion in the papers about drugs. So in the Jewish newspaper, they wrote an article about drugs, and they said, drug taking goes back a long way, and many famous people have taken drugs, and they say we learn from the Old Testament that even Moses took a spliff in the Sinai desert after coming out of Egypt. They said we learn that even Moses smoked in the desert after coming out of coming out of Egypt. And astaghfirullah, what they were trying to say is that after running away from Fir'aun and after leading his troublesome people out of Egypt, when he got his first opportunity to relax in the Sinai desert, what he did is rolled himself on. Ma'adallah. So the Yahud today do not respect Sayyidina Musa alayhi salatu wasalam, nor did they do so then. Ma'adallah. And this is it. So they said to Musa alayhi salatu wasalam, pray to Allah who the killer is. Sayyidina Musa alayhi salatu wasalam said, Allah tells me to tell you to slaughter a cow. So they said, do you take us as a joke? Sayyidina Musa said, no, ma'adallah, I don't take you as a joke. Just do as Allah says. So they said, okay, ask Allah. This is an actual conversation. Pray to Allah and ask Him on our behalf that, what kind of cow? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said to Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam, and Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam relayed the message. Ultimately they were talking to Allah through the medium of Sayyidina Musa alayhi salatu wasalam, to ask him what kind of cow. So Allah said, neither young nor old, but middle-aged. Then they said, still we don't understand. Ask Allah what colour. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, yellow, it should be bright yellow, whose yellow colour pleases onlookers. They said to Musa alayhi salam, we still find it difficult to understand which cow. Tell Allah that, it's ambiguous, it's very unclear. Make it more clearer for us. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, apart from the former conditions, it should be a cow that has never been worked before, that has never been ridden before. It should have never pulled a plough on any field, nor should it have ever given water, or drawn water, or given water to any land. And apart from that, the whole cow, its skin and its hairs should be of one colour. There should not be a single mark on the entire cow. It should be perfect. You want to ask questions? Well, Allah will answer them and Allah will impose further conditions on you. Then Banu Israel set out to find the cow. Before they could have sufficed with any cow. Now in the whole of Banu Israel they had to find a certain cow, and there was only one. And there was a young lad who sold the cow at an extortionate price to them. Then they got the cow and they slaughtered it. And then Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam told them, bring me a piece of the flesh of the cow. They did so. And he instructed them to hit the dead man, the corpse, with that with that piece of flesh from the cow. When they did so, the corpse came to life. The dead man rose. And then he pointed to his own nephew and he said, he is the one who killed me unjustly. And after identifying his killer, he died again. This is the story of the cow, and why the whole surah has been named after this certain story. There are many other stories of Banu Israel, and then towards the end, because Banu Israel they connect themselves to Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salatu wassalam, and they say he is our great grandfather, he is our forefather. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salatu wassalam, and who he really was, and his example, his way, and the fact that Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salatu wassalam is more closer to the Muslims than the Yahud, and how Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salatu wassalam, along with his son Ismail alayhi salatu wassalam, both built the house of Allah. How they built it and how they prayed, and after building the house of Allah, how they prayed for their people, that may Allah raise amongst them a prophet, and that dua was accepted. And who was a prophet that came in response to the dua of Ibrahim and Ismail alayhi salatu wasalam? The Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And then Allah Azza wa Jal speaks about how the prophets were neither Jews nor Christians, rather they were Muslims, all of them. And then Allah because of the Kaaba, Allah speaks about the turning of the Qibla from Baytul Maqdis to the Kaaba. Quite a few verses of Surah Al-Baqarah, the last part of Surah Al-Baqarah, are devoted to this. When the Prophet ﷺ came to Medina, for 17 months approximately, he prayed Salah, and all of the Muslims, not facing Mecca, but rather Jerusalem, Baytul Maqdis and Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. During that time, however, the Prophet ﷺ, with all love and respect for Masjid Al-Aqsa, he was very eager to face the Kaaba, because all of the Muslims who emigrated from Mecca to Medina, they longed to return to the Kaaba. They longed to return to Mecca. It was their birthplace, it was their home city. It was where they grew up. It was the most blessed city on earth. And that's what they longed to return to. And they also wanted to face it because of that sentimental value. They also wanted to face it in Salah. And not just for sentimental reasons, but also for reasons of barakah. However, it was Allah's instruction and they accepted. But deep down there was this longing. And the Prophet ﷺ would pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that Allah allow us to turn to the Kaaba once again. And he would forever raise his noble head towards the heavens in anticipation of wahi and revelation that would finally instruct him to turn back to the Kaaba. Another reason was that the Yahud, being who they were in Medina, they used to taunt the Muslims and the Prophet ﷺ because they faced Masjid Al-Aqsa. So they would say, look at him, he claims to be a prophet, He claims to be a prophet, yet, and he claims to have brought a new religion, yet he is forced to face our qibla when praying. So they would taunt the believers. So finally Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, after 17 months after the hijrah, he instructed the Muslims and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam to return to facing the Kaaba in Mecca. So quite a few verses of Surah Al-Baqarah are related to that and devoted to that. Following that, Allah Azza wa Jal advises the believers to do certain things and to abstain from certain things, i.e. He instructs them to remember Him, to engage in His dhikr, to seek Allah's assistance through patience and prayer, not to consider those who have been killed in the way of Allah as being dead, to remember that Allah will test us, and the successful ones are those who, when they are tested by Allah, they say, Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. Allah blesses such people. Allah then mentions one or two laws about Hajj and Umrah. And then Allah again curses the Yahud who conceal the truth even though they know it, and who conceal the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah then speaks about the signs in His creation. And then Allah speaks about on the Day of Judgment how those leaders who corrupt their own people and take them away from the religion of Allah, they shall be punished in the akhirah. And each, the followers as well as the followers, will be trying to distance themselves from one another. Allah mentions that. Finally, Allah reminds believers to eat halal and not following the footsteps of shaitan. And to remember that shaitan will instruct us to do evil and lewd things. And then Allah again instructs the believers to be grateful for all His rizq and His sustenance, and to worship only Him, and to eat only that which is pure and halal. And together with that, Allah mentions that blood, swine, flesh of swine, carrion, dead meat, and anything which is slaughtered, not in the name of Allah but in anything else, these things are haram. And then finally again Allah refers to the Yahud, that these people, they conceal that truth which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave to them. Allah will severely punish them in the akhirah. And those who conceal knowledge, not only the Jews but also others, Muslims as well, who conceal the truth which Allah has revealed in His book, and in lieu of that truth they purchase a meager price of the dunya. Allah Azza wa Jalla says, they eat the fire in their stomachs, and Allah will not speak to them on the Day of Judgment nor purify them. These are people who strangely have sold guidance and purchased misguidance in place of it, and who have sold Allah's forgiveness and purchased punishment in lieu of Allah's forgiveness. With these verses, we ended that portion that was recited today of Surah Al-Baqarah. The remaining half, inshallah, we shall recite tomorrow, and I shall also explain the summary tomorrow. May Allah Azza wa Jalla give us the tawfiq to understand. May Allah grant us the tawfiq to recite the Qur'an as we should, and to act on it, and to understand its meanings and its message, and to act on them as we should. Wa sallallahu wa sallam ala abdihi wa rasulih nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. I'll suffice with this today.
This lecture was given by Shaykh Abu Yusuf Riyadh al-Haq and has been presented to you by Al-Kawthar Productions. For further information, additional lectures and books, contact us on 0121 773 5191, or alternatively by post at Al-Kawthar Productions, P.O. Box 6008, Birmingham, B10 0UW, United Kingdom, or visit our website at www.alkawtharacademy.org. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.